Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the AgCom Network podcast. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your host for this episode, and I'm reporting from the College of Aces at the University of Illinois campus here in Champaign. And I am so excited for this Facebook Live today because I think this is about as close as I might ever get to interviewing President Trump is through Sara. But yes, our guest today is Sara. Excuse me. Sorry. This is live. It's not edited, so I can go back and edit whatever I want later on. Our guest today is Sara Wyant from Agri-Pulse Communications. Sara, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, good morning, Kelsey, and thank you for the opportunity to join you on Facebook Live. It's a real honor and a privilege, and I've been very fortunate to have a wonderful career in journalism. I grew up on a farm in Iowa. My family still farms there, raising corn, soybeans, and wine grapes for a winery. My husband and I now own a farm in North Dakota, which is a cow-calf operation, small grains, alfalfa, and honeybees there. So we have kind of diversified backgrounds in agriculture, but I graduated from Iowa State with a degree in journalism and minors in political science and English, and had the wonderful opportunity to be an intern for Wallace's Farmer, which is a farm state magazine in Iowa, similar to Prairie Farmer. And then when I graduated, have a chance to work for Farm Progress. At that time was Wallace's and Prairie Farmer and Indiana Prairie Farmer and the Wisconsin Agriculturist. So really great grounding in Midwestern agriculture as a background. And then had a chance to go to Farm Progress, where at one time I'd been an intern and then become vice president of editorial for all their magazines.
Wow.
Ranging from American Agriculturist in New York to California Farmer in California and a lot of places in between. So we went through a lot of different changes in ownership. Some folks don't know this, but Prairie Farmer was part of ABC for many, many years because they wanted to buy WLS Radio. And in order to do that, they got State Farm magazines. So the Farm Progress Group was owned by ABC, then Cap Cities bought ABC, then they were bought out by Disney. So we were Musketeers for a while. And then Disney decided to sell off the non-entertainment assets. And so during that time, I had great exposure to some of the other folks in ABC and Disney. But then we got sold off to Rural Press Limited. And that was an Australian firm. And so during that time, got to visit Australia. And through all of this, of course, I was very active in AAEA and learned a lot through the association, gained tons of good friends and mentors. And so that was very, very important to me. And then a couple times in between, once in the mid-'80s, I quit the company to work as my own company called Agri-Pulse. And then later on, in 2002, we went through a lot of changes at Rural Press, and I didn't have a job anymore and was doing some consulting. And one of my friends said, we really liked it when you used to do a newsletter like I did in the 80s. It was in print then. In early 2000, I could do it all electronic. So I borrowed $5,000 from a friend and launched my business. And so this is 14 years later.
Here you are today.
That's right.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your timeline, because I'm just sitting here thinking of all the shifting and changing you have seen in your career in agriculture, specifically in agriculture media. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there's been a tremendous amount of change, primarily in technology. When I started in 1980, we didn't have computers in the office. We were making double copies with carbon paper and handing one off to be run down to, the presses. So that has changed dramatically. I was one of the early adopters of new technology, brought a computer in the office, and I can remember my coworkers saying, we're never going to use one of those. But, we've all adapted, and the technology continues to change and in so many ways make our jobs easier because we can do things like you and I are doing right now. We can publish all electronically, and so I don't have to run to a printer and run to the post office and all that kind of stuff I used to do in the 80s with my newsletter. So it's made our jobs a lot easier, but also in some ways more time consuming because you're never really off. You have to make sure that when I get a text, as I often do, 4:00 in the morning, somebody has a question, do you answer it or do you shut your phone off? Well, I answer. And so, it makes for some late nights and early mornings, but we've got a great team now of 5 really great professionals in Washington, D.C. working in our company and freelancers all around the country that are contributing. And so it just takes a bigger village to stay on top of everything.
We were talking about that, Sarah, before we went live, talking about how you were kind of looking through Twitter to see if any breaking news was coming out. And I told you, if there's any breaking news, go ahead and share it online. And then you spoke to how your phone never really turns off. And I'm kind of the same way. I set some boundaries sometimes, but I'm the kind of person that always wants to be in the know of what's happening and checking Twitter for any breaking news or any developments and anything that's happening. Either it's in Washington, D.C. or here in the state of Illinois where I'm located. And probably one of the Twitter users that you follow is kind of the topic we're going to talk about today is President Trump. I'm sure you refresh his feed daily to see what he's tweeting about.
Yes, I do, as well as several other public officials. And we make sure that we're trying to follow these things because there can be breaking news just through one of the president's tweets. And sometimes that's very market sensitive. If he, for example, says anything about tariffs on China, if they go ahead and implement those tomorrow, that will be very, very impactful on farmers and ranchers. So most days I get up and scroll through our Twitter feed and make sure that I'm not missing anything. And that's how I kind of get my news in the morning, in addition to reading Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times. I kind of go through a list.
Good. No, I know several people that do that, and I've been trying to make that a habit as well. We were talking about digital, but I still like that concrete in my hands, reading the newspaper or magazine or anything like that.
Well, I read all the digital editions, so I don't have them physically.
I do both, but I'm still one of those people say, oh, newspapers are going to die out. I don't believe that. I think everyone still likes a good copy in their hand, but digital's convenient, like we've talked about before.
Well, I would agree with you, Kelsey. I mean, I still do like to be able to pick up a book or a magazine too.
Mm-hmm. So our main focus today, but we've been talking about a little other things, which has been great, is your interview with President Trump. And like I said in the beginning, this might be as close as I'll ever get to interviewing him. I don't know. Who knows? I don't. But I wanted to talk about the nuts and bolts of your interview. So, Sarah, do you want to kind of start with how you got this opportunity to interview him at the American Farm Bureau convention, which was this past winter, correct?
Correct. It was in January, and we were asked if we would be interested. Obviously, the White House press team has to be able to understand that you are somebody that's going to be knowledgeable about these issues. And so they enabled Farm Bureau to select 2 different media companies, in addition to President Duvall. So here's how it followed. Basically, they asked us if we'd be interested. Of course, we were. We were going through the process prior to the president's speech at Farm Bureau. So if you haven't ever done this before, basically, they didn't ask you for questions in advance or anything like that, which we weren't interested in doing. What they do is that you go through security clearance, and a lot of that is like hours before you're going to talk to them. And so the 3 people that were going to do the interview were President Zebby Duvall from American Farm Bureau Federation. He spoke to the president first, and they videotaped that, and then RFD TV, and then Agri-Pulse. And so we go through all the clearance, the dog sniffing, all that kind of stuff, go up and see the room, do the camera setup, and Spencer Chase, who on our team, was in charge of the camera, and Phil Brasher, our senior editor, was there with me. And so you set everything up and you get the ground rules from the gal who at this time was a gal who was coordinating everything. And she basically said, here's how you do your setup. But when you leave the room, all the cameras have to be turned around except for the one that is going to be live at that time. And then you go out and you sit in the hallway in the bowels of the hotel for a couple hours. In this case, we did have a chance to leave for a little bit and come back. But lots of times you hurry up and you wait. And so President Duvall did his thing, RFD did theirs, and we were each told we'd have about 5 minutes. And, that's not much time, but for our purposes, we knew that we wanted to ask questions about key issues that were on the minds of farmers and ranchers. And that's how we approached the interview, basically. What could we ask him that he would actually be knowledgeable about and be able to give us some insight into how he looked at these issues? And that's what we did. I mean, we weren't going to go in there and ask him some softball questions about, don't you like American farmers? Our first question, my first question was, are you really going to withdraw from NAFTA? And he flowed. Yeah. He flowed really well with his answers. And I know there's a lot of people that don't care for President Trump, but you got to give him credit for understanding agriculture issues and being conversant on them in a way that I thought was, very good compared to the other presidents that we've talked to. And it's not a long list, but I shared with you my photo I keep in the office of George Herbert Walker Bush. He was one of my first interviews. And then we had a chance to interview President Obama shortly before he was first elected. Stuart Doan on our team did that over the phone. So this was nice to have that live interview. You walk in the room, the camera turns around, and you're on. So you either make it or break it in that 5 minutes.
Yeah, I did. As I told you earlier, I did watch the video. And we were talking about digital media earlier and how it actually is a video that you can actually see you interviewing Trump, and you can see kind of his body language and things like that. And for those that are interested in watching this video, I'll link it up in the show notes later on so that you have a link to watch the video. And Sarah, I'm kind of curious how this interview compared. You mentioned Agri-Pulse has interviewed 2 other presidents. How did this one compare to past interviews with the presidents? Did anything stick out to you in particular?
Well, as I mentioned, we have, as an industry collectively, I think, gone and watched the State of the Union and watched speeches with a president and really wondered if he would mention farm or agriculture or, anything to do with our industry. And in this interview, I talked to him about NAFTA. I talked to him about other trade agreements. He explained how he really likes bilaterals as compared to multilaterals. I asked him about Farm Bill. He talked about crop insurance. We talked about immigration. I mean,
he covered a lot.
He really was able to answer almost all these questions in a way. Some of it wasn't consistent. For example, in his budget, they proposed a $30 billion cut in crop insurance. But when you ask him, he said, yeah, I really like crop insurance and I really want to get a farm bill done. So, there were some contrasts with some previous things that had been issued by the administration. But for the most part, I think he really was able to roll with any question you could throw at him in terms of some of these key issues. And you continue to hear this president say, we love the farmers and he wants to do things. Now, whether or not his trade policies end up hurting a lot of farmers, we're already seeing pork producers suffering from the tariffs from China and from soon to be from NAFTA imposed disputes over steel and aluminum. So, time will tell how history will judge how he's really impacted agriculture, but he can sure talk about it.
Yeah. You mentioning all those different issues. How is it for Agri-Pulse? How important is it to cover all these different topics? Because they're everything from trade to the Farm Bill. These are deep-rooted topics. How does your team go about making sure that you cover such a broad industry, specifically in Washington, D.C.?
Well, we do have a really talented team, and they're veteran reporters for the most part. Spencer's a little newer on our team, but he joined us again as an intern and has done a great job of just immersing himself in these issues. And so if you work on our staff, you need to be able to go to an event, and maybe it's not what you wrote about last, but you might have to jump from a trade to a renewable fuel standard to a nutrition issue. All of these things, as our readership at Agri-Pulse has grown and our viewership, we want people who can ask the kinds of tough questions that will yield results, because people want to know, what does this mean to me? Why is it important? And why should I devote my time to reading or watching or listening to something Agri-Pulse does unless they can provide that?
Right. I think you just hit the nail on the head, talking about journalism in general. Nowadays, with so much information and with the internet and social media, there's so much information out there, but people just want to know, how is this going to impact me, and what should I do about it? And they want the information then and like straight then and there, right now in the moment. And I think that goes to show with social media, like we talked about earlier, all this connects, breaking news and making sure people get in there. But how do you handle being a credible source as well? I know, while we're on the topic of talking about President Trump, the hashtag fake news has become such a trend right now in the journalism world. How do you combat and make sure you are a credible source with your followers?
Well, it comes with our brand promise of really having the balanced reporting and the unique insights that our team is able to offer. We pride ourselves on, excuse me, on having the balanced reporting, that we're going to talk to Republicans and we're going to talk to Democrats and we're going to talk to critics, and make sure that that's part of our mix of reporting, so that people know that they can trust our insights. And when it comes from us, and I think that this was a kind of a fun moment at Commodity Classic this year, that Secretary Perdue was not very happy with some of the coverage that he was reading, and he challenged us on whether or not it was our reporting. As it turns out, it wasn't ours, but somebody in the group, one of the other fellow reporters, stood up and said, if it's from Agri-Pulse, it's accurate. And I think people understand that, and they do trust us, because it's not that we don't ever make mistakes, that we don't ever have typos or something like that, but we are going to approach every issue with that kind of honest lens that people have been known to trust.
Yes, thank you for answering that, because I know it can be a tough question, talking about credible news sources and how people throw the media out as all bad nowadays. But thank you for answering that with your honesty. And I know it's not an easy topic to talk about, but kind of shifting gears, I want to talk to you specifically about being a woman in this industry. And a lot of people think that agriculture is a male-dominated field, and not so much anymore. Many women are rising to be farmers and other professions in this industry. But as a woman and as a journalist, how do you take initiative and take direction in your career?
Well, I think I've always been committed to lifelong learning, and that is a skill set that I would recommend for any young journalist. And that is that you learn not only about the issues, but you learn about the people, and you build relationships. Mm-hmm. And in our business, having those relationships, people you can call on, people, when I started my career, Pam Cole Henderson was the first female reporter that had been hired by Prairie Farmer. I was the second in modern day ages. I mean, Zoe Murphy had been back in the 1930s at Wallace's Farmer. But so here we had come along and really started to break some barriers. And when I was named VP at Farm Progress, I was the first female to break through that management layer. So you do run into a few folks who really are aware that you're a female and that it's different. But for most of my career, Kelsey, people have respected what I've been able to bring in terms of talent and relationships. And so I just say continue to work those and to let people know that you're interested in them and you're interested in the overall success of the company or the effort, whatever you're working on.
No, that's good, because that was one of my ending questions I've been asking guests is, what's your biggest piece of advice to young journalists as a respected journalist in your own industry? Do you have anything to add to that, to specifically to younger journalists?
I like people who have this natural curiosity and they want to keep asking questions, and they're also willing to listen and to learn. And so those qualities I think are very important, as well as to continue to stretch yourself. I mean, there are days I write about things I don't know anything about, but I figure out who I need to talk to and who I can trust as a source. And you push yourself into some new areas, because if you always stay just in this one little pathway, you're never really going to be able to spread your wings. So I think that those are the kind of natural characteristics that you want somebody to have in an employee. And if you ask my employees, they can tell you that sometimes we throw them into the deep end and they've all been swimming just fantastically. So
they're yeah. What kind of the reoccurring theme of this podcast, which I know we're only in the third episode, but kind of the reason I wanted to start this podcast is because I think we're always learning, no matter if you're my age in your early 20s or you're a distinguished journalist who's has been in the industry for 30, 40 years. I think it's important to always keep learning. And I often quote my commencement speaker, who was Nick Offerman, who played Ron Swanson in the hit show Parks and Recreation. I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but he told us to always maintain the attitude of a student and to keep learning, because I firmly believe you'll never know everything, but you can sure try to make sure that you're learning and working towards a common end goal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The other thing that I think is really important, and at least in our style of journalism, is that I tell our crew that I like to practice the Wayne Gretzky style of journalism. And that is, I don't always want to be talking about what's happening now. I want to be like Gretzky and thinking about where the puck's going and where we need to be focused on in the future, so that you're always going to have to, like the Farm Bill passes the Senate Ag Committee as it just did. You're going to be writing those stories. What's in it? What does it mean? But then let's think what's next. What are the politics around whether or not how it moves to the Senate floor? What are the expected amendments? And so you need to be looking ahead as well.
No, that's good advice. I think not only relevant to you're talking about covering ag policy, but covering a lot of topics, whether you're in or out of agriculture, and looking to how you can serve your audience better. Because at the end of the day, as journalists, we're serving an audience, like we talked about earlier, and they want to know how this is going to impact them and when. So that's very good information. Sarah, is there anything else you want to share before we end this live stream to our viewers? It can be anything about journalism or covering Washington, D.C., or a favorite story you may have.
Oh gosh, I've got a lot of favorite stories from over the years, and I kind of carried it as a badge of honor in the last month. You've got both Republicans and Democrats who have called me up or said something like, you need to do more of this or more of that. I think it's a testimony to our balance that we provide. If you've got people on both sides of the aisle occasionally upset with you, that's a pretty good thing in my business. But I'd have to say one of my favorite stories was dating back to the first time I started to do our CEO salary report. This was stimulated by some discussions that were happening between the American Soybean Association and the United Soybean Board when the United Soybean Board was first started. And I had, at that time, and this will really date me, Kelsey, at that time I got a late night fax without any tracks on it. So I couldn't tell what number it came from. And somebody said, you really got to check into Ken Bader's salary. I think he's making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so I thought, well, I don't know what he makes, and I'm not sure how I'm going to find out what he makes, but how do you publish Ken Bader's salary and not put the corn growers or the Cotton Council or, put it in perspective?
Right.
And so then that was when it led to finding out that every nonprofit files a 990, and on that 990 with the IRS, you can also find salary levels. And so we got those, and I at first only published those core commodities, but it was a very delicate process. Nobody had ever done it before. And as you can imagine, if you're the CEO, you're not probably used to people thinking that they should all know your salary, maybe your board. So we published that. And when I was in the process of finalizing it, I went to one CEO whose name I've never revealed. And I said, I'm doing this, and I explained the background that I just explained to you. And we'd like to include you. And he said to me, Sarah, I would love to know what Ken Bader makes at the American Soybean Association. But if you, and he pointed his finger at me, if you ever publish my salary, I will never speak to you again. Wow, I'm just a few years out of school doing this thing, and I'm thinking, wow, I got the CEO, giving me the strong message that he's never going to talk to me. But it was just, it was just wrong, So I did it. I published his salary and everybody else's, and he never spoke to me again. Never, ever. And he had his staff not take phone calls from me either. So I'd have to sneak around, and find him in Washington, D.C. pubs or on the Hill at receptions in order to talk to him because he didn't want to talk to me. But he didn't stay there much longer, and so it passed. But we're in the middle of working on our annual CEO report again now. It's grown to a much more extensive report. And so we've got hundreds of CEO salaries. It takes a lot of digging. We'll be working on it for the next month or so. And it's that kind of in-depth investigative reporting that I really love for our team to do, in addition to the daily things. It's not necessarily a popularity contest, but that's not what our job is. Our job is to bring people perspective. And I'm very proud of the fact that we have organization leaders now who, if they want to switch jobs, or if they just want to know if you're a board member, what's an appropriate level for somebody working in Washington, D.C. or St. Louis or Chicago, what's the appropriate level of pay given the size of the organization, they call up and they ask for our report.
I think that was a very good note to end on, talking about the honest reporting. And I think that goes for all the journalists out there that are watching or maybe listening to this podcast, is being honest in this profession. I think you'll win over a lot more people than staying silent. So,
absolutely.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. I know you're a very busy person. You said you were coming here and then you're leaving for a luncheon. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your insight and perspective into covering Washington, D.C. and your interview with President Trump. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kelsey. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you to all the viewers that are watching, and thank you to all the podcast listeners that are soon to be listening. I will stay tuned in because I'm not sure when the next podcast is. I probably should have looked at that before I came on live. But look for updates on the AAEA Facebook page. We'll have details about our next Facebook Live, and you can catch this podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a great day and great weekend.